Welcome back to week 3, and this week, we get to talk about World War II, and I do truly mean get to, because whenever we get to wake up and get to have another day, especially to get to engage with something we're passionate about, or engage with something that's going to make us a better person so we can show up in the world in a more complete way, then that's definitely a privilege. So we get to be here today and get to do this. And because I said I would last week, we're going to briefly talk about we're not going to get too deep into the nitty-gritty of World War II, of the battles, and even the people. It's been so thoroughly picked apart that there are so many, frankly, better sources for minutia in details, like even World War II in color on Netflix, if you just want a quick episode blow by blow of certain battles and certain movements. And just then beyond that, there's so many incredible books and sources just that will help you dig through really the nitty-gritty battles and things of that nature that don't get covered too much. Really focused on is the implications of World War II, because it was that we're telling the American story, I guess you could say. Then World War II was the midpoint of the American story, where we had the rising action starting with Spanish-American War, and now you're ramping up and you have them join into World War I, and now we have the midpoint of the American story with World War II, and everything after this is going to be just like the heading towards the climax, which is where we are today. And so without further ado, so the Eastern Front with Russia. So Russia got involved in World War I, and it was, I guess, same as much of Europe, was a monarchy, was sort of broad strokes and broad movements that we were talking about last week, where the monarchy was coming to an end and new ways and perspectives of viewing the world were emerging. And so particularly in Russia, because there was this lavish lifestyle of monarchy and this absolute pitiful standard of living for just the common man, I guess you could say, there was just this huge disconnect and rumblings of revolution, rumblings of people being unhappy, which is a consistent theme throughout history. If the times are good and you have a semblance of people, when people are happy and making money, they focus on building their own lives. And when things are not good and people are unhappy and people can't build their own lives, that's when they start rebelling and voting, like in our current political climate, voting in populist candidates or fringe candidates and doing things that are detrimental to society versus doing things that are good for their own lives as well as good for society at large. And it does fall on leadership to make sure that times are as good as they can be, so that overall everyone, the rising tide raises all boats. But in Russia, and in much of medieval history, they were not doing this. And so 1917, towards the end of the war, pretty much as America is joining, Russia is leaving, because they had been just awful conditions, and they had, once again, the monarchy was convincing them that they have to join this war, they have to do it. And once again, World War I was basically a war that was being fought because they had to, because there were crisscrossing alliances and Russia was coming to Serbia's aid. So there's no real reason for these young men to be fighting and dying. And coupled with just awful economic conditions, this became a hotbed for the 1917 revolution, which was communism. It was socialism, it became communism. And I can see why a policy of collectivism was attractive versus ideas of individual sovereignty, which took root in a very positive way in the United States, of the individual kind of pulling himself up by their bootstraps and being their own man, and why the policy of collectivism was very attractive to a certain groups of people in Russia. And because the monarchy is frankly toxic individual sovereignty. It's like the idea that the individual is most important, but taken to a toxic extreme and not really earned. Like monarchy is where it's kind of the ultimate, yes, the individual is most important, but it's not earned at all. Like at least in the when America and when the idea of the entrepreneurial spirit is taken to its best possible extreme is when you have someone who's truly exceptional because they've worked on themselves and they've worked on something that will better themselves in society, and then they've earned what all the rewards that come with it. Whereas toxic monarchy, especially in this particular period in Russia, they had not earned any of the lifestyle that they were enjoying, and were kind of just tone deaf by being part of this war and sending all these young men to die for a frankly senseless cause. So there was basically just that's all I'm going to say about just the 1917 revolution, where run by Lenin, Trotsky, Stalin. Would love to dedicate more than enough time about them at a future date, future series. But Russia, major turning point from monarchy to a socialist republic for all intents and purposes. And so Russia now, out of the war, is now kind of, they're doing their own thing, their own socialist experiment. And the Roaring Twenties begin, where at a time, at least in America and much of the Allied nations, of tremendous economic activity. The Weimar Republic is this new republic in Germany. So once again, no more empires, no more monarchs, just a lot of nation states and republics, democracy, this fledgling idea of neoliberalism starting to take over the world. This was really the early 20th century, was really just a war of ideologies. As I said, you could argue that they're all neoliberal, and there was just arguing about what type of neoliberalism would win out, whether it was evolutionary neoliberalism, which was basically what the Nazi Party would begin to extol, or whether it was, which is funnily enough a far right, if you're looking at the political spectrum, a far right ideology, or if it was the collectivist and equally bad ideology from each according to their abilities, to each according to their needs, which was not taking in any sort of individual exceptionalism at all. It was, what can you bring to the table, and we'll distribute that equally to what they need. So it really just wrecked any sort of incentive to be exceptional, because you knew that you were just going to get the same thing as someone who either was not exceptional or was frankly just lazy and knew that they could work the system, and which is a far, on the political spectrum, far left. Communism is a far left ideology. And so you had those two warring ideologies, and then you basically have the funny thing about the type of neoliberalism that exists in the world today is even though we have our left and right parties, we have our Democrats and our Republicans, they're both basically centrist. If you were to actually look at on a full ideological scale, they are both pretty centrist, both of our parties. They just happen to be on either end of our smaller political spectrum of neoliberalism. And so you basically just the causes what led up to World War II. So of course, the rest of the world's pretty much doing great. You have in America, it's just a time of the Roaring Twenties. You just have a time of tremendous, exuberance. There, plenty of corruption, plenty of just racism, but also you have W.E.B. Du Bois. You have a lot of great social advancement as well, but you just have a lot of, as is a roaring 20s, you just had a lot of crazy movement forward economically, socially, intellectually, and it was kind of just a crazy, when women got the right to vote, and they were starting to be able to smoke cigarettes and go out dancing, wear shorter dresses. It was definitely just, it was a social leap forward. and you just had you had working conditions that were getting better. You had eating, like clean eating bills. You just had a lot of legislation that was like, we want to take the next step forward. And Germany was kind of being left behind a little bit with their being gelded by the sanctions economically. And you had like half the population who kind of just wanted to move forward, and half the population that was just resentful about what had happened. And conditions just weren't great. And then eventually you got into a period of just hyperinflation that they also got kind of wrapped up in the whole people were like taking out loans, like huge margin loans, and then were putting it into the stock market because they thought that they were led to believe that the stock market would go nowhere but up because things were great and things would just be nothing but great. And we just had these frankly unscrupulous bankers in all parts of the world who were convincing the common man that they should literally take out like $100,000 loan, shit ton of money back then, shit ton of money now, but a shit ton of money back then, and basically take out that loan and then use that money at like a 30% interest rate and put it into the stock market, because if the market kept going up, then they would, see a rate of return of say 50%, because that'll completely cover their loan plus 20%. And then, but if the stock went down, then they would, because of the interest rate, they would have like a 500% net loss, in that one. But of course, the bank pretty much won either way. But so the person who was getting squeezed was the common man, who thought that this was their maybe not get rich quick scheme, but this is they're kind of saying everyone can be very rich, everyone can afford to live exceptionally well with minks and furs and all these grand, cars were not just Model Ts anymore, they were fancy cars. And so that was the Roaring '20s, which all kind of came crashing to an end in 1929 when Black Tuesday, when the stock market crashed. And we're not going to talk too much about what happened because it's pretty complicated. Just for all intents and purposes, the stock market crashed, and everyone lost a lot of money, and then there was a panic, and that was really the main issue. It's not necessarily that the stock market crashed that was the main problem, it's the resulting panic. There was a group of businessmen who got together and pooled their remaining money and said, hey, we have to inject this money back into the market, because if we do, we can maybe still this panic, and the market will go back up, and then we can just ride it out and figure out what to do then. Because this is kind of the first time that this happened, where we had a complicated economic system that then completely collapsed. And that unfortunately didn't work, and the result in bank runs, the common man was going to the bank and demanding their money. And if you know anything about how banks work, money is a construct. Money is a IOU for all intents and purposes. And I guess all intents and purposes is the word of the week, because it's a phrase that I just got a fucking boner for that phrase this week, so you're just gonna have to run with it. And so for all intents and purposes, money is just a construct. It's an IOU that we agree that this has value, and we agree that it has value based on X, based on the economy on a certain day. And so people were going to the banks and demanding their full savings from the bank, and everyone was doing that, and the banks just don't have that kind of liquidity to cover it. And so banks literally had to close, and when banks close, then your entire savings just is gone, because that bank has now closed their doors, filed Chapter 11 bankruptcy, and basically has said we can't cover these debts, and therefore bankruptcy allows you to just wipe the slate clean, where you no longer have debts. And so not everyone, but most people's life savings were just completely gone. And that led to the Great Depression. And so that's what happened with the Great Depression. So that happened, maybe not 10 times worse, but happened probably like 5 times worse in Germany, where people were literally wheeling in wheelbarrows of Reichsmarks, because they were worth more as like kindling and like to burn than they were as currency. Like that's how bad things were in Germany. And so Nazism was like this kind of right wing fringe, kind of loopy, like Alex Jones political movement, which had like a little beer hall putsch. That was like this crazy moment by the Nazis, by Adolf Hitler, where they did like storm into like a the Prussian government building and took hostages and were like, we're taking over. Like within, they had like members of the military. They were trying to have get a sort of botched coup together. And Hitler was arrested and put in prison with one of his associates, and it was I believe it was Rudolf Hess. So he's put into prison with this guy, and this is actually like one of the great ironies of history. I love how we just go back to the great ironies of history, where Hess is the one who kind of radicalizes Hitler. Like Hitler is kind of just like this, and I would love to go into a deep dive of Hitler's psyche as well at a certain point in time. I don't think it's correct for this broad strokes series, but Hitler is basically just kind of like this, and I hesitate to really even call him like a narcissist, but he's kind of like a puppy left out in the rain who dad was an alcoholic, not really his real dad. Mom was the only one who really like loved him and cared for him in the world. Dies of breast cancer. May or may not have been from a Jewish surgeon, which once again just more fuel to the fire of his hatred for Jews. Kind of more of just like the elite, but kind of just kicked around like his whole life. Never fit in anywhere. Didn't even graduate high school. Graduated eventually with like a GED. Like he was kind of just on the street for his early part of his life, like early part of his adult life, where he like bought a cane, basically like a pimp cane, and like really like nice clothes, but he was like broke and he was homeless, so he would like walk around Austria like with like a pimp cane and like nice clothes. So I guess he kind of literally looked like a pimp. He like looked, and this is like his idea of like what rich people did, and just like walked around and basically I guess got self-esteem from the way that people looked at him and was like, oh, he doesn't have to work and he dresses like that, so he must be wealthy. But he just was broke and was unemployed, but he just liked having that identity and having that image, and eventually joined the German military in World War One, and like we said, had that crazy job running between trenches, and ended up actually getting injured from gas and being in a hospital, and got the equivalent of like a German Purple Heart, and that was kind of his first like moment of feeling like belonging, and like he fell deeply in love with like Deutschland, deeply in love with the idea of a strong Germany. And so Rudolf Hess kind of radicalizes him even further and says that like you're the savior that Germany needs, you're the savior that Deutschland needs to lead us back to greatness, and kind of radicalizes him with this idea of Lebensraum. And Lebensraum is the idea of basically that Germany needs quote unquote living space, and that Germany needs to expand its borders and boundaries because it needs more territory, and it was kind of like the idea of like manifest destiny, like in America. It's like we need to create a continent because God wants us to spread our greatness and spread our ideas, and that's manifest destiny. That's why we have the continent of the United States. And Lebensraum is basically the German manifest destiny, which was just we need to take Belgium, take France. We need to have a strong, basically united Europe with us and our ideals at the helm. And that was kind of Hess kind of radicalizes Hitler in that way, to be like basically builds him up like you're the Führer, you're the savior of Germany, like you're going to be the one who pulls Germany and Europe out of this fucking mess that the Jews, the quote unquote Jews, created. So Germany kind of already had been rearming itself very quietly in Russia, so technically it was like sort of in the within the confines of the Treaty of Versailles, but had been quietly rearming itself and there was this military arm that was planning on bringing the Kaiser back, but then when around 1930, Nazism starts to actually go head to head with communism for like who would be the dominant ideology, and kind of through the 30s, through like the 1931, 32, 33 was the early 30s was when Hitler and the Nazis solidified their hold on Germany through propaganda, through like it was a time when people are scared and when there isn't economic activity or opportunities, people turn to a strong populist leader. And that's exactly what happened in Germany, where you had this guy. He was already pretty radicalized already. He was probably he was kind of manic. He was I don't know if he was depressive, but he certainly was manic. And when you have a manic person who's egged on by someone else giving him ideas like he's the savior of Deutschland, then you get a pretty potent recipe. And he was a very charismatic and good speaker. If you look at any of his speeches, he practiced. He was very good at speaking and holding attention and holding a crowd and saying exactly what, and riling up a crowd and saying exactly what people wanted to hear. He basically, the ideas at the time began the idea of the Untermensch, which was Friedrich Nietzsche. It was kind of a bastardization of Nietzsche's work, which Nietzsche famously spoke about kind of the birth of humanism and modernity, which was the quote-unquote death of God, which God had been the, I guess, uniting and driving force for much of Constantine and the Roman Empire, when Catholicism was adopted by Constantine, all the way through like the Age of Enlightenment with John Locke. So probably about like around 1000, even before that, but like 500 AD, we'll say 500 AD all the way through about, we'll say 1750, like around that's a long fucking time. And just to give you just the official scientific term of that, how long that span is a long fucking time. And so Nietzsche basically said that we'd reached a place where we became rational, and God is dead and we have killed him. And so he came up with this idea of like the Untermensch, which is the Superman, which is there will be a man who rises above, who's rational, who's this, who's that, and he had all these qualifications for who he would be, who the Superman would be. And basically the Hitler and the German people co-opted to say, we are the Superman, we are the one who will rise up, a new world order, essentially. The Third Reich, it was supposed to live for 1,000 years. And this thinking was what, this twisted thinking was what eventually just led to the Holocaust, which was what you had the idea of, we are the Superman. Okay, what defines a Superman? Okay, it's funny because Hitler wasn't really any of these things, but it's blonde hair, blue-eyed, intelligent, tall, strapping, smart, and brave, like all these admirable things, I suppose. But like, he's like, okay, we're going to build our culture on these things, and then we'll have a very strong, homogenous culture that we'll be able to move forward. So it was kind of like I was saying, it was evolutionary neoliberalism, which was, the idea that it's a open and free society, but only for this one subsect of people. So if you were, anything other than that, if you didn't check pretty much most of those boxes, you were a subhuman, and depending on how bad your subhuman status was, you could just be killed. If you were, so like autistic people, even if you were, homosexual, gay, lesbian, trans, or if you, any of those ways that you would identify yourself, if you were, which wasn't unique to Germany either, but just worse in Germany. And if you were Jewish, they were the major scapegoat of World War I, which doesn't make any sense because they fought bravely along with their German counterparts. But just you pick a social group that a minority that doesn't have too much power. And there's a lot of history about the Jews in Europe because Christians never could handle money. It was a sin. It was a sin of simony. And so Jews, taking what they could in a smart way, they became a lot of the bankers in Europe because their religion allowed them to be bankers. And because of that, they got very good at handling money and got very good with banking, and were the bankers, frankly, for a lot of Europe, just because Christians, it was a sin to lend money and charge interest. So that was the sin. And so Jews were like, hey, I mean, I got no issue with it. Like, God has no issue with it. Our God, like, and that kind of that's a stereotype of Jews being very good with money. And that was something that Hitler exploited, was like, oh, they're exploiting you and your money. And they were the ones who owned the banks, and they're the ones who told you that you could make it rich and sold you, this loan and told you to put it on the market and then fucked you. They were the ones who did that. He blamed the Jews entirely for the Great Depression, for losing World War One. Basically any problem was a Jewish problem, and that's what he called it, the Jewish problem, is that they were the worst thing that happened to the world, and they needed to do something about it. And so that led to the Holocaust. And I'm not going to go, I guess, too deep into the Holocaust, just how horrific it was, and especially in this, I feel like, day and age where there are actually just Holocaust deniers who just deny that it happened or denied it was bad as it was. It was terrible. And like books like Night by Elie Wiesel, Devil's Arithmetic, the movie Uprising about the Warsaw Ghetto. It's just like you need to educate yourself about in other because there are genocides and things that are happening much much closer to today, whether it's in like Africa, Rwanda, whether it's the ethnic cleansing in Kosovo. Like there are other things that you should be aware of, but this was something that the survivors continue to die off, and we need to continue to tell history the way that it was. And so it was systematic. It was genocide. It was awful. So that's about that. And two blunders that led to Hitler losing the war. Like I said, we're really not going to go too deep into the war. But Hitler could have won the war. And the two things that, first of all, he should have listened to his generals, but his just cult of personality got completely out of control. Because he was a very shrewd person, I felt like, early on in the war, leading his rise to power, and early on he was a very, very shrewd individual, and he continued to take drugs on a daily basis. He had like a cocktail of drugs. Like if you watched Matthew McConaughey in listing off all the drugs that he takes on a daily basis on Wall Street, like Hitler toward middle to the end of the war, same thing, was taking uppers, downers, he was fucking all over the place. So didn't listen to his generals. Two major blunders that basically contributed to him losing the war. Did not bomb. He was bombing military targets in Britain, like Liverpool, and bombing them into submission, and they were going to try to invade Britain in a similar way that we did D-Day in France. So they were going to try an amphibious assault of Britain, and so they were taking out all these airfields, all of these ports, and he made a promise to the German people that not one bomber would make it to Germany. And ironically enough, the RAF had a bomber that got over Berlin and had a payload and they had to drop the payload. And so this led to Hitler moving in an emotional decision. He stopped bombing military targets in like Liverpool and Hull, and he began bombing London because it was tit for tat basically, and so began bombing the civilian centers in London, and that's led to the air raids and like people the all of Churchill's amazing speeches and rallying the British people. And like the stay, like all those signs, like stay calm and carry on, that was the bombing of London. and which he was trying to break the spirit of the British people, and rather than break their infrastructure. And Churchill, being the leader that we and the British people needed at that time, did not allow Hitler to break the British spirit. And the second major blunder, which I'm sure people are much more familiar of, was attacking Russia and opening up an Eastern Front based on his dumb racial policies. Like Russia at this point was, run by Stalin, which I would love to get into. Russia, once again, so much to get into, but just for all intents and purposes, word of this week, run by Stalin. They have kind of an uneasy peace. I would say even like Hitler's the one who's uneasy about it. I think Stalin's happy about it. And because of Hitler's dumb racial policies, he sees the Slavs, he sees the Russians, as the Slavic people, as Grosum, as subhumans, as people who are unworthy, as people who need to be exterminated. And so because of dumb racial policies, he basically is so probably literally, but at least figuratively, coked up on his success in Western Europe by just taking Belgium, taking France, taking most of Western Europe. He has Italy as an ally. He decides to open up a war on the Eastern Front, and also send his tanks, his panzers, his blitzkrieg into Russia, and they get as far as Stalingrad, which is very close to Leningrad, very close to the capital. And that's the famous movie Enemy at the Gates, where the Russians literally had just thousands of men marching to their deaths, where they had the front line carrying rifles, and when the man in front of you was shot, the man in front of you picked up the rifle and kept marching, and then when that guy was shot, then you picked up the rifle and kept marching. And when you were shot, I guess you didn't have to worry about things anymore. But that's how bad it was, and they continued to fight, and they continued to fight against the Nazis, who were literally bent on exterminating them, almost as equally as they were bent on exterminating the Jewish people. And that's why there was just a hatred of the Nazis by the Russians, by the Slavic people, and which will, at the end of the war, we'll come back to, because that's very important. And so he makes a huge blunder. Similar to Napoleon, the Russian winter freezes literally and figuratively the advance, where the blitzkrieg doesn't work because the gel, the lubricant needed to keep the tanks moving forward, the tank treads, literally freezes block solid. You have they're not properly clothed, they're dying from exposure. They stall the invasion of Stalingrad, and they slowly push it back. And the U.S. of course enters the war in 1942 because of basically we put an embargo on Japan for oil that we were trading with them, because the Japanese were committing acts of atrocities in China, and were getting their saber rattling in remember colonial possession of the Philippines, and getting pretty aggro over there, bro. And so we told them that, hey, we cut off their oil completely. We said, and they're an island. And they said, we're not going to give you any more oil. And they were pretty chuffed about that. Say that they sent us the declaration of war that morning, and I think it did arrive, but they basically sneak attacked us in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. And they probably would have, once again, great irony of history, probably would have, perhaps would have won the Pacific War had our aircraft carriers been, or most of our aircraft carriers been in port. A bunch of our battleships were, only a couple aircraft carriers were. Most of them were out performing drills and maneuvers in the open ocean. And so we of course lost a whole bunch of people, tragedy, but as the admiral leading the attack said in a famous quote that about Pearl Harbor is, because they said it was a tremendous success, and he said, I fear all we have done is awakened a sleeping dragon and given him terrible resolve. And it's about right for as far as badassery, World War II, Marines in America kind of takes the cake. So that's kind of the how that went. So it was a much more cut and dry conflict of good versus evil. And I guess Italy is kind of a superpower, but mostly two superpowers, as in Japan and Germany, very proud nationalistic cultures and countries bent on just taking a lot of territory for themselves, and had very strict cultural views about the way that they wanted their world to look, their worldview and their world to look. And it was pretty totalitarian, and obviously with them on top. And it's ironic that Hitler's racial policies, once again, another great and like full of ironies in World War II, his shitty racial policies led to the Austrian-born Jew, Albert Einstein, might have heard of him, to emigrate to the United States. And also ironic that the lead on the Manhattan Project, so the project that, codenamed Manhattan Project, which is about developing the atomic bomb, which the Germans were also trying to develop. So you have the Germans and the Americans trying to develop this weapon, this basically, this kibosh, this weapon that would end the war. And you have both the Germans trying to create it with heavy water, which is just water, it's H2O with an extra hydrogen, and they're trying to develop it that way. And they're trying to develop it with their best von Braun and their best scientists, and their racially pure supermen scientists, fucking idiots. And meanwhile, the man who was pretty much pivotal to figuring out how to do it, Albert Einstein, emigrates to the United States because of Hitler's dumb Jewish policies. And also ironic, the lead on the Manhattan Project, there's a movie coming out about him from Chris Nolan later this year. Robert Oppenheimer, also Jewish. So then they created the atomic bomb, and would love to get deeper into that. And I'd love to watch that movie when it comes out. I love Chris Nolan, but maybe we'll if you want to do a whole series about the Manhattan Project or World War II, we can dig into that. But for all intents and purposes, Albert Einstein, Robert Oppenheimer, pivotal to creating the atomic bomb, and both Jewish. And so the Nazis, once again, because of their shitty racial policies, don't develop the bomb in time. And so I think the implication of this, the thing that I'm driving at, is the Nazis' belief, their core tenet of racial purity, of a homogenous society being better than a melting pot of different cultures and people who bring their strength and weaknesses to a society, was fundamentally debunked. Because America, as a melting pot of cultures, was the huge winner of this war and won the race to build the bomb, and was relatively untouched by the war, and was the one to instill their ideology across the world. And so America's ideology was the one to win the day. And that's basically the broad implication of World War II, is that these ideas of a strong, homogenous culture being, and you have one race or religion, culture, whatever you want to call it, being better than all the others, was fundamentally debunked by a country where you did have a ruling class, we'll say, a ruling class of predominantly one race or one culture, but it was still you had all sorts of different people contributing in all sorts of different ways, and they were the ones who won the day. And I think we do well to remember that. Not to be, stroking, I guess, America's dick too hard, because not that we were perfect, because we did have the state arrested thousands of Asian Americans and put them in detention centers. And I hesitate to call them concentration camps, because they weren't on par with Nazi concentration camps. They weren't death camps, but they were detention centers. And these were free Americans, a lot of them, store owners, a lot of them just very, very, some of them even first generation, second generation, very bringing a lot of value to America, into their communities, were stripped of their rights without trial, had their property taken from them by the state, like it's a fucking nightmare, and like redistributed. And like, where these Asian Americans, when they got out of the detention centers years later, they would go back to find their homes and their stores, and their property just had been basically impounded and like sold off, and like their lives were just gone. So it definitely is staying on FDR and the American legacy of in that moment. So as I say, we would do well to remember that we won this war by having a diversity of opinions and cultures, all being able to weigh in. And so by the end of the war, the U.S. and Allies, just to take you through kind of the quick, broad strokes. So Hitler was unable to break the British spirit. He's unable to even get to a point where he can land a beachhead or even consider an amphibious assault, because the RAF is able to get their airstrips and their enough squadrons together to continue to defend against the bombings and against the attacks, where they are able to repel them sufficiently where they push them back. And the U.S., and who's now entered the war, and the British are able to establish a beachhead in Normandy. So Saving Private Ryan, like crazy opening sequence, is they're able to establish a beachhead in Normandy, France, which is it was Eisenhower was the general who was the supreme commander of the Allied forces in Europe. So President Eisenhower was the man in charge. So that's, talk about a fucking leader, right? So they slowly begin to take back France. They win a series of battles in northern Africa, take back Italy, basically paratrooping into Sicily, working their way up Italy, kicking Mussolini, which we didn't really talk about Mussolini because, frankly, he's kind of like a non-issue. Like, we'll maybe at some point talk about him. He did a lot to nationalize and a lot to bring Italy into the 20th century, and he was kind of an early fascist figure alongside Hitler, but didn't really do too much. Like he had these dreams for Italy, bringing it back to like Roman glory, and it was kind of just a fucking failure. But so the Red Army pushes through Russia, Poland, and eventually into Germany on the Eastern Front, while we're pushing into Germany on the Western Front with vitriol and hatred. Just underline those two words, vitriol and hatred, pushing through Russia, Poland, and eventually into Germany. And so Germany is being squeezed on both sides, culminating into eventual surrender when the Red Army is the one who takes Berlin and flies their flag over the Reichstag, which is the Parliament building. And then that's end of the war in Europe. The end of the war in Japan is obviously the use of atomic weapons. And this is a contentious topic, and my 2 cents on the whole issue of the need to do so, because you have a lot of people just talk about how horrific it was, and it was, but when you have to use violence to resolve a conflict, you're generally looking at 2 unsavory options. And so this is why I think that Truman, because FDR died, so Truman was thrust into the position of whether or not to do this, and I respect him deeply for doing it for these reasons. The projected casualties. So this is the Battle of Okinawa, which is a small island off the coast of Japan. It's at the bottom of Japan, southern part of Japan. The U.S. land, they take the island. So the U.S. bore about 50,000 casualties, 49,000 casualties, including 12,000 killed. And the general was actually himself killed in action. The Japanese losses were about 110,000 Japanese soldiers lost, just dead. 110,000 Japanese soldiers lost their life. And it's estimated that between about 40,000 and 150,000 Okinawan citizens were also killed. So that was just we're talking about 260,000 dead Like that's I guess 150 would be the top estimate, but we're talking about at the very least 150,000 Japanese dead and 50,000 Americans dead. And so that was a tiny island off the coast of Japan, and that's because that's how they were fighting. They were fighting tooth and nail. They were not going to surrender. They were arming their citizenry. It was protected that 1 million Americans would die trying to amphibiously invade Japan. And the general, this is allegedly the general, said to Truman when he told him about the bomb, the capabilities of the bomb, the 2 bombs that we had, that can you imagine if this gets out, that we had the capability to theoretically end this war, and we chose to send 1 million Americans to their deaths because we were just not willing to use this weapon, and let alone the Japanese casualties, because that's the difference, because more people died in the Battle of Okinawa combined than both atomic bombings combined. So both atomic bombings. So it was basically on par with the Battle of Okinawa. About the same amount of people died in both blasts, both atomic bomb blasts, and the Battle of Okinawa. About the same amount of people died. And that was for a tiny island off the coast of Japan. That was not mainland Japan, because they were arming their population. It would have meant the extermination of the Japanese people and culture. And I actually tend to really enjoy Japanese people and culture. I enjoy their sushi. I enjoy their music. It's amazing the way that it's, because they developed on an island, their way of thinking and way of art and culture is so different and unique to Western culture, and it would have meant the end of that, because they were arming their citizens with Sten machine guns, ceramic grenades. And we know this because the Japanese mafia, the Yakuza, got their hands on these weapons post-war and became very powerful because the Japanese government was arming everyone. And so it would have been a war of door-to-door assault. It would have been door-to-door assault, extermination. It would have been worse than the quagmire that we got into in Afghanistan. It would have been millions dead. The casualties that happened, while incredibly tragic, got us to where we needed to be. And what's worse than what we're also not really thinking about too is, remember I said vitriol and hatred of the Russian people. So when the Russian people came from the Eastern Front in Europe, there's an event that's known as the Rape of Berlin. And not to say that the US or the British were not involved in this, because they probably were, but the Russians in particular got to Berlin. And something that I guess thankfully isn't, maybe because we don't have giant wars of nation states anymore, it's not super as common, I suppose. But what used to happen in warfare is people would come in, they would take an area, and they would rape the women basically as a show of dominance. It's like, oh, we beat you in this conflict, and now we're going to rape your women. And that was something that the Russians did for weeks. Is that historians believe that as many as 2 million German women were raped after the Soviet Union and Allied forces defeated Hitler's army in the spring of 1945. For decades, German women largely kept quiet about the trauma. But so about 2 million women. And so that's, I guess, to tack on to your casualties rate. If we were talking about a war of extermination, a war of door-to-door warfare, you gotta factor in the hatred and the blood boiling, the feeling that there would be probably a rape of Japan, that there would be this awful, traumatic, sick cycle of violence that would just break so many people. And also what we're not even talking about is the battle plan was for the US to invade from the south, from Okinawa, and from the Russians, because the Russians have a little strip of land that's pretty close to Japan. The Russians were going to invade from the north, and we were going to meet in Tokyo. And so the Russians would have came down from the north, with their vitriol and their hatred. Probably not as much as what they had for the Germans, but certainly raping and pillaging and attacking in the U.S. from the south. And at this point, probably just as bad, the hatred and the rape. And they would have met in Tokyo, and it probably would have turned into what Germany turned into, which was East and West. And the state of Japan would cease to exist, and as I said, perhaps the Japanese people and culture perhaps would cease to exist. So the top two reasons: the use of nuclear weapons gave people a clear idea of the devastation. So this is luckily before hydrogen bombs, which we did go on to develop, but it gave everyone pause in the future of ever using them again. So because we're the only ones who had them, and because we used them, everyone knew what the devastation would look like. And I know that's kind of a bit of a callous thing to say, but on this large scale of things, it probably saved us from perhaps a great filter event of a complete annihilation of the human race. And so the fact that we used it and everyone saw what happened, I think we've never used them again. And I think that there's a reason for that, is because we saw what can happen. And so those are my reasons, where oftentimes in war you have to make really, really, really bad choices. But I think on the whole, this is a choice that you have to make every single time, even though it's a bad choice. It's the lesser of, I don't even want to say two evils, but the best choice that you can make. And that was the end of World War II, period, was when Japan surrendered. I will say Japan, the U.S., to their credit, did not make the same mistake that Britain made, which was they offered pretty generous surrender terms. Japan did have to completely, de-arm themselves, and except for just defensive weapons, which still to this day they have basically treaties with Britain and with Australia, with the U.S. defense treaties, where if they're attacked, we'll come to their aid, because they don't have any offensive weapons. They have only defensive weapons. And we're honestly, because we helped rebuild their nation and their culture, they went through a boom in the post-war era. In the late 60s, 70s, they went through a huge boom. So it was eventually in their best interest to surrender and be part of the global economy, as we'll continue to talk about, as most countries realized. So the legacy of World War II. On the whole, the conflict, the death of humanism emerged in the wake of the death of God, quote unquote, as pronounced by Friedrich Nietzsche. And so liberalism was on the way. That was kind of going to be the new ideology. Empires were done with monarchs. We're done with any sort of, because that was the thing in Japan, is it was an emperor and his divine right. We're done with divine right. We're done with all of that thinking. Now we're moving towards liberalism and neoliberalism, and what kind is it going to be? That was really what World War II was about, is what kind of ideology is going to be put in place in the 20th century and beyond. Is it going to be one that champions the individual or the collective? Is it going to be one that, America, that champions the individual, or one that champions the collective, in the Soviet Union? Is it going to be one that prizes a certain ethnic group above all others, like in Germany, or even in Japan? Or is it going to be one that stubbornly clings to the beliefs that all men are created equal, and not to say that America, as the champion of this idea, even, is the best example, especially with, our African American population, which fought bravely and amazingly during the war, comes home to a nation where things have not changed. Women who are, brought out into the workforce come home to a nation, the men come home and basically say, all right, go back to the kitchen, get me a beer. So it was not perfect, but we began moving in that direction. And at the very least, we brought our ideals to the shores of Normandy, throughout the Pacific and beyond, and pushed back the tide of evolutionary humanism, which at the very least, was a great thing. That was a great thing. Um, because yeah, Japan was not as it was about as racially homogeneous as Germany, and prided itself on its culture and its purity. And they did not they did not do things as systematically as Germany. I think that's what's so horrifying about Germany and the Holocaust, is how cold and systematic it was. But they certainly did plenty of just horrific things, like Bataan Death March, I think it's called the Unit, I forget the numbers, but they basically were doing similar brutal experiments to what Germany was doing, freezing people, and just to see what would happen, like just horrific things. So, not this, they were, even though like the atomic bombings were terrible, also they were not innocent victims, we'll say. And World War II also saved America, and indeed the world, from the worst depression in the capitalist world system. It's the worst depression that we'd ever seen, really, before or since. Like, we've had some bad ones, but that's the Great Depression, because we really weren't prepared for it, and we didn't have the tools for it. We didn't have any sort of Keynesian economics or any of the tools needed to really repair the system. We didn't have any FDIC insurance. We didn't have anything. So World War II, because we needed manufacturing, we needed to produce, we needed things. Basically, it allowed for a boom of GDP and pulled us out of the Great Depression. Another legacy, this is the end of the Pax Britannica and the beginning of the Pax Americana. So like I said, kind of one of the last nails in the coffin was the Treaty of Versailles and the poor leadership of that was showed by the Pax Britannica. This is the beginning of the Pax Americana, where Britain, because they had been bombed to shit, like, this was kind of just the end of the Pax Britannica and the beginning of the Pax Americana as the preeminent leader of the free world, like, where America was really relatively untouched by the war. We just had factories and a manufacturing sector that was humming. We were the ones who, while we were beefing with Russia in Europe, we were the ones who basically helped win the war in Europe, and were helping people, helping Germany, helping Europe, trying to instill our vision of the future in Europe, and we were the ones who won the Pacific. And so we were really instilling our ideals across the world. It was also the end of the age of imperialism and colonialism as like a legitimate practice. So like, yes, America kind of definitely engaged in like internal imperialism and colonialism in the form of like the Philippines and Guam and all that good stuff. But Europe, there's a huge age of imperialism and colonialism as just a legitimate practice. This is okay. And if it was, whether it was Africa, whether it was the Indies, the Caribbean, just they were colonizing these territories and areas. And this is really the end of that, where they release pretty much all their colonial possessions, and which kind of also leads to a bit of an issue, because Britain is basically just creating these borders without any consulting the people, or without, really without much knowledge. They're kind of just saying, okay, here's a border, and not really talking to the people. And so you could have basically put a line through someone's village and said, okay, these people are that, and these people are that, and maybe even put two cultures who hate each other within the same country and said, okay, figure out what your taxes are going to be, figure out what your policies are going to be, which leads to all sorts of conflict and wars in the future. So I guess one more kind of nail in the coffin of the kind of bad leadership of the Pax Britannica. This leads to the creation of Israel as a Jewish state, and kind of the beginning of the Palestinian conflict, where after the Holocaust, Jews had been moving to Palestine for kind of a long time. There was this movement called Zionism, and they were just setting up these, a lot of them were little kibbutzes, which are like kind of little communes. Some of them were communists, some of them were just, little communes of Jewish people. And they kind of coexisted with the Palestinians for a good amount of time. there was war and there was conflict, but it wasn't, and there was kind of, people who were diehard Zionists who wanted a Jewish state, and there were people who just wanted to coexist. And but Britain was the one who basically, legally owned the land. Like, Britain owned Palestine, as it was called at the time. And the Holocaust was kind of the last straw where Britain said, okay, like, in the world at large, said, okay, like, the Jews have suffered enough, they deserve a nation. They want a nation, we'll give them a nation. Like, the British were basically like, they don't want a nation, we'll give them a nation. And they did, and that caused the Palestinian conflict, which is still happening today. And we'll go into that at some point down the road. But that's where the conflict stems from, is Britain owned Palestine and basically said, at the end of the age of colonialism, basically said, okay, like, we'll make it a Jewish state, and everyone will recognize it as a Jewish state, which began the Palestinian and Jewish conflict. And so the last real legacy, it sets up the U.S. and the Soviet Union as the two preeminent world powers, and now with opposing viewpoints of neoliberalism. So, like, evolutionary humanism basically debunked as a form of ideology that's going to work. And so the U.S. run liberal, democratic, capitalist society versus the Soviet Union, which is a communist, collectivist. The collective is more important than the individual communist viewpoint. Those are the two ends of the spectrum that are now going to duke it out for the next 50 years, where one prizes individual liberty as a cornerstone of society, and one centers its policies around how everything you should do should be about the collective and moving the collective forward. And so next week we're going to talk about why communism doesn't work, and the Cold War, and just kind of the 50s, and we're going to talk about, buzzword for next week probably, multilateral institutions. We're going to talk about what they are, how the U.S. set them up, and how they still continue to propel or support the Pax Americana to this day.